And I'm on a roll.
Welcome to The Network is the Edge with Insight Director of Services, Jeremy Nelson, and Insight Practice Director, Network and Integrated Security, Rob Parsons.
Hello, I'm Rob Parsons, and today I have with me Jeremy Nelson, and we're super excited to talk to you about the network edge and how we're really using the network edge to redefine secure access to anywhere, from any device, and really bring together communication and connectivity in the world that we know today. So with that, like I said, super excited to have Jeremy Nelson here with me. We're going to dive into the modern edge. We're going to talk about the landscape that we've been dealing with in the previous years, as well as leading up to current time. We're going to talk about business innovation. We're going to talk about how that is really driving technology, and technology has to be there to support the innovations on the business side. We're going to talk about the genetic makeup of how we look at the modern edge. We will talk about the different components and ultimately pull together a reference architecture to help you think about how you might navigate your modern edge solution within your environment. And then ultimately pull together some closing thoughts about how you might start to attack a modern edge conversation, how you might start to engage around making changes within your organization and driving towards the future. So with that, I want to start us off, and I think the slide really says it all, that there's really no limits to the demands on the edge. And we've been talking about what the edge is experiencing as far as exponential growth for a number of years. We're talking about now that those IoT devices that exist on the edge are more in a machine-to-machine type of communication mechanism, which makes east to west or horizontal security very, very critical in the way that we apply our edge architectures. We also talk about wireless connectivity being the primary source of connections for a lot of these IoT devices, but also for the end users and for the devices that we bring onto the environment to ultimately help us drive the business transformation that we're looking for. Now, we've been using 3-to-1 as a network scaling mechanism as we think about how we build architectures. We've been thinking about that 3-to-1 ratio of devices to people and leveraging that in the scale of architecture we put in, whether it's the number of access points, the upstream links. If we think about the routing and WAN platforms, we think about 3-to-1 from a user perspective. Well, that was very forward looking, and I think that we're hitting an inflection point for where 3-to-1 is very real. It's not just the IT professionals that are bringing that type of device load to an environment. And then I want to take a minute, and we'd be amiss if we didn't think about this, but you have to think about the amount of data that's coming from all of these devices. You have to think about where we're going to store that data, how we're going to process it, how we're going to make use of what's important to maybe throw away the rest. And then how do we keep that data secure when it is stored? So there are a number of different things that we have to look at when we think about security around data. And all of this brings me to the big question that I want to start today's session with, which is, how do you define your edge? And that edge could be defined differently for just about anyone, but the fact is that we know that what we call the modern edge is evolving, and we're at an inflection point where it's an opportunity to get ahead of the curve and ultimately be able to provide for that business transformation. So I want to give you a little bit of a look at how we think about the modern edge. First, that modern edge of an enterprise is no longer well defined. And furthermore, that modern edge is at the branch, it's in a home office, within the cloud, anywhere, at Starbucks, you name it, that's where that connectivity expands to. And every employee, every device, and everything that's on the network has to be able to connect and communicate in a seamless fashion. And that really brings us what we need when it comes to access to our workloads and to our data sources. So that's what the premise around the modern edge really is. It's getting the communication, the connectivity, and the data to anyone, anywhere, and anything at any time. So Jeremy, I want to tag you in here. Can you take us through a little bit of the network perimeter that we were working with in the past as it pertains to the different locations and multiple clouds? Like, what are we working with here in current day architecture?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this, Rob, is when you look at these architectures, they're the same ones that we've been supporting now for going on 30 years, with the introduction of traditional local area, wide area, metropolitan networks. When we think about them, it was really easy to define that edge. I love the way that you kind of set this whole conversation up, is that the edge is expanding and it has to expand. And when we think about it, we look at our traditional network and security architectures, and they were very much framed around a highly defined edge. So whether that edge was the branch connecting to these very centralized corporate data centers where we hosted most of our applications, our data, everything was really kind of backhauled to these very large, easy to identify and control types of environments. And so when we think about that, right, we think about how things are starting to transform and what some of those highly restrictive, highly defined types of edge architectures look like, it starts to, introduce some interesting and challenging types of problems that we have to work through. So we really started to see this back at the introduction of the cloud. So the cloud, from both an infrastructure as a service as well as a platform as a service and a software as a service model, we really started to see business critical applications no longer living within the confines of these boxes that we had built. They started to drift out into these other centers of data. And so as we continue to try and support different device and end user communication streams out to these modern and different application styles, we really started to see a lot of inefficiencies in these very traditional network and security architectures. And you can see some of them listed here on the right of some of just the challenges that we've seen with these traditional highly defined edge architectures. So lots of the branches, the remote offices, connected back to these centralized data centers through different types of connectivity models, whether they be VPN, whether they be MPLS leased circuits, but they were they're very strict as far as the way that they brought connectivity from the edges back to these highly concentrated data centers. Well, when we think about that, there's always this issue of scale, and scale always turned into more money, whether that more money equated to buying different types of circuits, leasing those types of circuits. They then connect to these carrier backbones, and then the infrastructure that's required on the edge of those in order to be able to support those new flows of traffic. And then security then becomes a concern, because again, when we have these centralized data centers, we're routing everything through these large monolithic security appliances, and then sometimes we're double dipping into these because we're having to hairpin traffic as it comes in through one semi-secure part of the environment, and then hairpin out and go to another either semi or unsecured part of the network fabrics that we're supporting. And so what ends up happening is that as we add more features, as we start to increase and provide more security to these business critical applications, we're having to then scale up and make significant investments in hardware and other platforms. And then last but not least is the lack of flexibility. So as we think, so you did a great job of talking about the number of devices. So, we talk about three to one from a device to human ratio, and the machine to machine connectivity that creates this very diverse and distributed overall kind of mesh communication topology that we have to be able to support. And when we think about the way that we had to get data to and from different locations, so how all of our information was stored in one centralized location, as we think about these new dynamic communication and data exchange models, this becomes really, really impractical support, because we can't get the connectivity where it needs to be in order to be able to optimize and have that low latency, high capacity, low loss type of communication between the different nodes, end users, and devices that now make up these critical applications. And so
That's perfect,
obviously
Jeremy.
something's got to change, right, Rob? And I imagine we're going to
Yeah,
talk a little bit more about that.
absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it really comes down to challenges around performance, the security perimeter, and then the lack of flexibility with current architectures. So, I want to take us into how we see the modern edge. And, this is ultimately Insight's view of it. And what we see with the modern edge is really the connected home offices, the connected clouds, the mobile users in the branch, all connecting across any means of networking. So traditional networking through cloud, through Wi-Fi, into the cellular and 5G areas, and then ultimately across VPN as well, and giving our people and our devices the access to the data that they need to be successful in the way that they conduct business today. So at the end of the day, seamless access, optimized connectivity, and pervasive security are really the core tenets of this architecture and this framework when we look at the modern edge and we look about how we can evolve this to drive further business transformation. Now, Jeremy, I want to give it back to you and take a quick look at the evolution of data as we've seen, the new desktop era, the mobile device era, et cetera. Can you give us a little bit of context there?
Absolutely. So coming back to that reference architecture of that traditional edge network that I think we're all super familiar with, I think we can actually see when you look at this timeline and the overall expansion of the devices and connectivity that's required to run these business critical applications, it's really easy to see where we started and why something has to change. So if we go back and we look at this first plot on our data, on our graph here, it's really back in the 1970s, all about mainframe. So we look at roughly 1 million units out there. The majority of those weren't the computing devices. They were actually a series of green screen terminals that were serially connected to those mainframes. And so a very peer-to-peer type of relationship. So when we think about that edge, right? Very, 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 very highly concentrated. In fact, it was really the edge was your mainframe and then the serial connections out to those various units. Now, as you start to step up into the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, we can start to see the edge having to shift further as we got away from traditional serial communications and started to embrace things like local area networks, wide area networks, IP connectivity, as we saw the PC start to really become pervasive within the organizations that we support. The type of connectivity had to change. We started creating these data centers and we started having connectivity to the internet, as you can see here in the 2000s. So now we're up in the billions of devices. But again, our edge is now continuing to expand. So we went very, very focused around the mainframe, and we're starting to now focus into these data centers and these perimeter edges when we connect to these public networks. Now, it really starts to get interesting in 2010, where we start to see the proliferation of mobile devices, connectivity over cellular networks, where every device, every human being within our organizations is now carrying a connected computer in their pocket that has access to a variety of different corporate assets. So we start to see some of that shift happen to the point where we are today in 2020, with tens of billions of devices that are now connected. And these aren't just smartphones. These aren't laptops. These aren't just iPads or desktop computers. We're now talking about a variety of different sensors and data collecting devices that now go out and are collecting a variety of different data sets based off of business critical type of information and environmentals. And we collect that telemetry and we bring it back to a whole bunch of different areas. Again, coming back to that machine connectivity. They're either communicating amongst each other or decentralized IoT gateways, or back to data centers, or aggregating metadata and sending it out to the cloud. So we have these very mature and complex types of communication meshes that these tens of billions of units demand that are very, very different from what we used to support all the way back in the mainframe, the PC, and now the modern day.
Well, and Jeremy, I think some of the most exciting elements of this is really some of the applications and the use cases that we can bring in. If you look over, we've talked about IoT in the beginning of this, but, starting to think about augmented and virtual reality, automation, how you might apply some of those technologies into business use cases on the operations side to be able to give a unique business outcome. And that's something really incredible. But the fact is, it doesn't exist without the technology that we're able to bring to the edge today.
Absolutely.
So I want to take us into the next generation. So how do we look at this? We find some commonality across our client base when we start talking about the modern edge, and those that are truly leading in this way, we find that they ultimately acknowledge that their technology strategy and their business strategy are very tightly linked together. And they leverage their technology strategy purely as a way to get to business outcome. And they see that as a component. We don't see the operating silos of IT and the business being on different sides of the aisle. We see them coming together because those organizations recognize that that is absolutely critical. Furthermore, we acknowledge that change is constant, but something else that we have to be designed for that change. They have to be prepared. They have to know that it's continuous and that we're putting the pieces of technology in place to be able to enable that change and that agility and that flexibility, and ultimately to accelerate.
Sorry guys to interrupt here. We had a big pause in Rob's audio. That's why I'm jumping in right away. And it started right when he was talking about this slide. So if we want to take it from, let's pick it up from when Rob started presenting this slide. So we continue recording. I'm going to make a note here at 15:25.
Okay.
And I will make the edit. 15:25, Rob's pickup. So we will start with the slide in full screen, and then boom, Rob, you take it away. All right, let me get out of here.
Yep. All right. I want to talk about some traits of leading organizations when we talk about moving to the next generation from a modern edge perspective. And the first thing that we identify amongst clients as we talk with them about the modern edge is those who are really leading acknowledge that their technology and their business strategy are firmly linked. And that linkage is ultimately what enables the business to be more effective, to evolve faster, to be more agile. And at the end of the day, all we can acknowledge is that change is going to be constant. So we have to take the people, the processes, and the culture and ensure that it's designed for that continuous change. But a component of that is also the technology, making sure that the technology is agile, that it gives us the ability to be flexible and to adapt as needed to changing environments, whether it be changes in personnel. Maybe everybody needs to work from home for a period of time, or the processes need to change, or the culture is changing. The technology has to be able to support all of that change that happens in a business environment. And the modern edge, when built to a scalable reference architecture, is something that's going to take us to a platform that's able to execute against that.
And I love what you said there, Rob. You called out agility, but I think really what we're going to start talking about here in a second is all about disruption. I think we've witnessed that over the past, 5-10 years, where we've seen a lot of these verticals that you have listed on this slide that have been under significant attack from a disruption standpoint.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at any of these verticals, all of them have been something that we've dealt with for a number of years. Nothing's really new to market in this type of conversation, but the fact is that each one of these has evolved. If you look at agriculture, you talk about smart farming, the remote monitoring, everything that happens to be able to bring intelligence to predicting what's going to happen and how agriculture is going to work and what's going to be available at certain times for the supply chain. Incredible leaps and bounds advances in that space. We talked about manufacturing. I think you have to go back to the beginnings of automation in manufacturing, but also looking at what we have from a network perspective, how we can drive efficiency, monitor our assets, be more cost conscious, and many other elements within manufacturing. Utilities, healthcare obviously a major focus over the last year, being able to track our assets in a medical environment, both logically where they're connected, but also physically in a physical space, being able to track temperatures and otherwise secure data in a complex healthcare environment. And then getting into transportation, which was significantly disrupted with the likes of Uber and such. And then now we're moving into connected cities that want to make sure that data is available everywhere, that connectivity is everywhere, and ultimately enable those city resources to be able to change the way that they go about their day-to-day business within the city, but also the citizens of that city getting a unique experience. Maybe it's something digital divide, enabling those that don't have access to the internet to be able to get access, to be able to do a job, to be able to go to school, whatever it may be. But smart cities really enable that. So there's so much that we can talk about from a vertical perspective, and the what ifs and the different use cases and how we might disrupt those different industries. But I want to jump into some case studies and talk about some real world effects that we've been able to drive for our clients. So this first one is a large beverage bottler within the US. Super excited to work with these guys, but they had a major challenge. They deploy what are called laser guided vehicles. And in fact, they really should be called Wi-Fi guided vehicles. But at the end of the day, it's a robotic forklift that takes product from where it's manufactured in an automated fashion in a modern day warehouse and moves it around so that both manufacturing can continue, but also we can get that into the truck to be able to ship it and get it off of the loading dock as quickly as possible. And that's how this industry is able to recognize revenues by shipped product. So when they deployed those robotic forklifts, we discovered that they started having drops. And when they had drops, they had the forklift has to stop for safety concerns. So we looked at the existing environment, leveraged a number of tools, and ultimately identified that there was a legacy Wi-Fi architecture in place attached to a legacy hierarchical network. And at the end of the day, they weren't leveraging the cloud. The security mechanisms were, in need of update. And we were able to propose back a complete Cisco wireless solution here, which seamlessly integrated with NAC, with network segmentation to provide some of that IoT-based east-west security, and then ultimately to optimize their WAN performance as well. So really excited about what we were able to do with this client. And at the end of the day, the measure was not that the technology was successful. The technology was successful because the client was able to ship more product and ship it faster than they were before, thus recognizing revenue and showing an ROI for the solution that was integrated. All of this built on the reference architecture around the modern edge. So really excited about what we were able to do here. And the fact is, like I said on the earlier slide, you'll see some commonality between these different use cases. So now that we've been able to decrease forklift faults by 95% and drive an increase in productivity for this client, I want to take us to another client where we were ultimately able to save them a huge amount of effort, time, and money through automation. Jeremy, can you take us through some details here?
Absolutely. So one thing I'd really like to call out as we kind of dig into this real estate use case that we had around network and network security and really automation is that enhanced security for wired and wireless networks. You probably saw that that was the exact same point that was made on the previous slide that Rob just talked about. And really it came down to this concept of transient devices, devices that were coming in, connecting to the network, and basically connecting to the exact same network segment, the exact same assets and resources that were being used by those laser guided vehicles that he was talking about. Obviously, that poses a fairly significant security risk, both from just a human safety standpoint, but also as a business and an operation standpoint. So as we think about this large real estate organization that we supported, they really owned a series of malls across the country, and they survive their entire model around connectivity at their edge, being at their mall facilities, was really all about transient devices. So much so that they'd gone through and they built this very traditional segmentation model, again, coming back to that highly defined edge that we've talked about at the beginning of the presentation here. And they realized that in order to be able to continue to support that, it was taking hundreds of man hours where people were going in and making dynamic changes on a daily basis, just to ensure that devices, as they came on and off the network, were in the appropriate security context. But at the end of the day, they were still having disruption. They were still having exposure because a lot of that work was heavily dependent on the information that was provided and work being done by human beings who are prone to making errors. And so we were really excited to be able to engage with these folks because we were able to help not only increase security, and we all know what happens. Usually when we hear someone say, hey, we're going to drive this highly distributed micro-segmentation strategy, as IT specialists, we start thinking, holy cow, that is going to be an operational nightmare. And so really what we were able to do is we were able to use strategic platforms like ClearPass from Aruba Networks to not only drive highly distributed micro-segmentation strategies all the way out to the real estate edge, but we were able to do it in a dynamic and automated fashion that literally reduced the amount of operations. So we greatly increased the overall security of the infrastructure, all while decreasing operation and operational complexity. And as you can see, the stats here, this was actually taken directly from the client, that they were able to reduce overall hours spent on traditional network management and operational tasks by 620 hours a year. That is a significant amount of money. So, and again, when we have to remember that not only do we reduce that operational spend and allow them to work on more strategic IT initiatives, but we're able to increase the overall security of the entire platform.
That's phenomenal, Jeremy. Huge amount of savings. And I think that one thing as we get into the reference architecture in just a minute, we find that the automation and management really go hand in hand, because if you can't operate an environment, you can't recognize the outcome that ultimately it can drive. So huge call out there to the operational side of the house for looking at how we can leverage automation to improve what this client's doing. Now, you want to do me a favor here and take us through El Camino Health as well. I know, great win, great opportunity for this client to really advance what they're doing, and near and dear to everything that we've all endured over the last year in the healthcare space, really setting these guys up for success.
Yeah, and you touched on it great there, Rob. Like over the past year, we've seen not only the healthcare, just the traditional healthcare vertical, have to be far more responsive, agile, nimble, all those things we talked about that are drivers around the new edge, if we will, the new modern edge, but security. It seems like it's just human nature at this point that as tragedy sets in, there are people out there who try to capitalize on it. And we absolutely saw that within the healthcare space, that as the overall focus increased and the criticality of healthcare resources and assets became more and more important to us as a community, the overall numbers of threats and attacks on those infrastructures increased exponentially. And it seemed to be that every day we were hearing about some type of new attack, whether it was ransomware or some other type of exploit into these critical healthcare infrastructures. And so El Camino Hospital was obviously no exception to that. We're really excited that we're able to partner with them around really helping them mature and grow that edge that allowed them to be able to provide much more granular visibility and segmentation all the way out to the wired and wireless edge of their environment. And so when we think about this, we talked about two very holistic solutions. This is one where we leverage assets from both the Cisco portfolio as well as from Palo Alto Networks to really bring a really mature overall solution to the table that helped identify assets as they came on board, even to the point where different units, whether it was a mammography machine or a prescription locker, they typically look the exact same to the network. But based off of the solution that we were able to deploy, we were able to tell the difference between those two types of endpoints. We were able to then put them into their respective security contexts and enforced a whole different set of overall access controls based off of the identity of the device, not where it was connecting to the network. So we really were able to uplift the overall security profile, be able to allow them to more rapidly adapt and deploy new life-saving healthcare tools and assets, all while increasing the overall flexibility and security of the platform.
Awesome, Jeremy. I think great stories across the board. Obviously, able to help clients in a number of different verticals, this being healthcare. We talked about manufacturing at the beginning, and then ultimately commercial real estate and retail. So huge ability to leverage this reference architecture across a multitude of verticals and ultimately provide that flexibility and agility that we talked about earlier as a foundation to be able to recognize business benefit from a foundational network solution. So we've teased it so far, and I really want to dig in here. We built this reference architecture that revolves around helping our clients to really accomplish a few things. The first of them being to provide seamless access to services. We know that devices, whether they be Internet of Things devices, end user devices, servers, whatever, they're coming in across a variety of different mechanisms. The primaries, not all of them, but primaries being wired, wireless, and IoT gateways in this case. And we know that we need to drive some imperatives across that. The first is improved speed and performance. The next is how can we leverage additional wireless technology with the evolution that we've seen around LTE, around 5G, and now into CBRS, and the handoffs that we can experience between the cellular technologies and Wi-Fi architectures as well to give a seamless wireless experience for everyone who is trying to operate and work in a mobile environment. How do we make the deployments fast and agile? We can't have downtime and experience large amounts of impact to the business while we're making changes to technology. So we have to be able to do that quickly. And lastly, we have to be able to operate in any environment, whether it's on an oil well in the middle of the ocean, or it's a farm somewhere in some very challenging conditions, or maybe a mine or healthcare. Every environment has its own unique requirements that we need to make sure that these technologies stand up to. So all of that said, we've got to put together the wired and wireless architectures to be able to provide that seamless access to all of your workloads and your services, whether they exist on-prem in a data center, whether they exist in a cloud, they're managed at the edge. There's a number of different ways to do it, but we have to provide that flexible access to every service anywhere, anytime. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is all underpinned in management and automation. We have to have that foundation to be able to operate the solution. It has to be simplified. It can't be thousands of lines of code to be able to do the basics. We have to be able to do the basics simply so that we can leverage the automation to do what's complex. And pulling all of this together is really a complex task, and it can't be achieved without that foundation of management and automation. So moving on from access, and moving to optimizing connectivity. Jeremy, take us through SD-WAN and SASE and the great evolution that we've seen in this market.
Absolutely. So as Rob highlighted, we now talked about a lot of different types of access mechanisms that we have on the traditional endpoint side. And now what we need to do is we need to be able to take some of that same flexibility, that same agility, and bring that to that wide area connection. So really that's where SD-WAN and SASE come into play. So SD-WAN is really all around how do we provide edge connectivity? How do you provide connectivity to a variety of different centers of data with a high degree or a lot of variability in the types of circuits that actually provide that connectivity. So when we think about SD-WAN, SD-WAN is highly focused on looking into individual application data flows, understanding the underpinning and the business context around those specific applications, and then using the different tools and resources at its disposal to make sure that that data is getting to its desired destination as quickly and as efficiently as possible with as little loss between point A and point B. And that's really what SD-WAN is all about. It's really all about that flexibility. And then SASE is the overlay that we put on top of that allows us to be able to get that dynamic data flow, to be able to get data from point A to point B through these very flexible mesh networks, but to do it securely, to make sure that we're inspecting the data, that we're really putting in those access controls, not to just traditional on-prem, but how do we control access into some of these public assets like software as a service, infrastructure as a service, cloud assets. And that's really where SASE comes in. It allows us to bring in endpoint connectivity, whether that's end user devices connecting directly into a secure cloud, whether that's IoT gateways that are on-prem, flowing through the infrastructure to get to a workload living in a public cloud data center. And so when we combine those two together, we get that exactly what we're talking about: high flexibility, high agility, lower cost of overall operations, but increased overall security. And so when we think about some of the core tenets that we're trying to achieve here, again, coming back to scalability and reliability, when we're using SD-WAN, we're not necessarily confined to going out and purchasing those very traditional leased line types of access, because who knows, the sensors that we need to connect, like Rob was saying earlier, might be in a cornfield out in the middle of Nebraska. And so we can't necessarily rely on getting a high capacity, low latency, low loss MPLS circuit out into this cornfield. So we need to be able to provide that same type of connectivity, but over a variety of different connectivity mediums. So that's really where the scalability and reliability come from. That transport flexibility that I just talked about, and then the dynamic traffic steering. Looking at those data flows, digging into them, not just a matter of what's the source IP import and destination IP import. Let's actually look at what's inside the data. Let's understand what the application flows are, recognizing what the overall quality of service and security contexts are needed for that, and overlaying that and applying that within the fabric. And so really that's what we see. And then coming back to that same conversation around management and automation, there's a lot more data. There's a lot of other things we're making decisions off of. And so coming back to Rob's point, we can't do that through thousands or tens of thousands of configuration lines. This really needs that overlay of simplified management and operational automation.
And Jeremy, that really leads to all of software-defined networking, frankly, the ability to humanize what's going on in an environment. Like you said, take it a layer above the port and protocol and the address. You want to know what that data is, what it's for, how important it is, and be able to manage accordingly. And SD-WAN and SASE, just one foundational technology to be able to do that. But we also have software-defined mechanisms that range across the access side into the data center. And all of these kind of work hand in hand to be able to ensure that we get that optimized connectivity that we're looking for.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So that brings us to security. And, gone are the days where security was just an impediment to getting your work done. Security is very real. It's here to stay. And the fact is that there's a lot of work that goes into it day in and day out to make sure that it is as seamless as possible. I'm sure that we've all dealt with the concept of multi-factor authentication. And the fact is it keeps us very secure. We're able to revalidate devices as they come on the network and be able to make sure that we maintain a healthy environment. So coming back to that pervasive security concept, we still leverage our next-gen firewalls and our cloud security. We still leverage our network access control and ultimately threat detection services that many of the large vendors bring to the table. But we pull all this together with role-based access control, micro and macro segmentation, the detection of malware and ransomware, and then ultimately containing those threats, because when we do identify that, it's not if, but when we do identify that there's been an impact to an environment, we want to mitigate that impact. We want to make it as small as possible. So how can we quarantine that device? How can we put it in a sandbox? How can we prevent east to west traffic access when it's in an unhealthy state? We have the technology to be able to do all of those things, and we can do so in a way that doesn't impact productivity. So super excited to be able to put this entire wrapper of security around the entire access architecture and the optimization structure that Jeremy just talked about. And again, back to management and automation. If there's anywhere that management and automation is absolutely key, it's in security. Security has so many events that happen on a day in and day out basis that we have to be able to pick out the repeatable actions and activities and automate them so that we can take the most important, the most difficult to digest events and put them in front of the humans that are available to be able to look at this and make decisions and be able to write those rules. And how do you make sure that you're not, beating the same event every day? Once you've achieved a solution to a problem, you want to be able to have that repeated in a seamless way and move on to the next. And so that's what management and automation is all about in the security space. Now we've talked about three components. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the only other thing that I would add to that is that as we talked about at the beginning of our healthcare use case, is that it really comes back to your threat surface today isn't the same as your threat surface tomorrow. This is something that is changing by the hour at times. And so the ability for a human to be able to keep up and to stay in front of those threats is virtually impossible. And that's really, like Rob was saying, where this type of automation and machine learning really comes into play and is the most effective tool for keeping our environment safe going forward.
For sure. And I mean, we've talked about it. We're reaching remote locations that may have never had internet or network connectivity before, and we're making them part of the network. So huge focus for us is going to be security. Now, I want to pull all this together because we've got three really great foundational components around providing access, around optimizing connectivity, and then now pervasive security. So what does that look like when we put it all together? It looks like this. We build a foundation, what we call the modern edge, which provides the access switching, the Wi-Fi, the IoT connectivity, the sensor network components, the routing and the compute assets at the edge to be able to provide that computing infrastructure, that intelligence that we're looking for from a network perspective. We drive it from a management and automation perspective, and ultimately secure it. And this builds a foundation for all of our things, our devices, our machines, our data to traverse to and from our applications and through our analytics engines, and ultimately to optimize how businesses operate from where they are today. So the modern edge is this. It's that foundational network component. It's a wrapper of security, and it's completely automated and optimized for our applications and for our analytics. So really proud of what we've been able to do with this reference architecture, how we've been able to drive outcomes for our clients as we've gone to apply it. And the fact is that it's put together in a modular fashion. So if you're not ready to bite off the whole thing today, you can take the steps towards the future that will help you to evolve this direction, knowing that you're going to have some of these needs in the future. So I want to start with asking you a few questions, the same as we did in the beginning. The first is, as you think about the session today and you go back to your office or you go back to your home office, I want you to think about how can you make access more seamless for your users, more seamless for your devices, and more seamless into the different clouds, data centers, and applications that they all need to use, those centers of data. I want to ask you how you can optimize your connectivity. Is it an SD-WAN solution? Is it SASE overlaid across something that you already have? And how can you ultimately give the best experience with the least latency, the highest speed, and ultimately a seamless experience for whatever endpoint you're trying to service? And then lastly, I want to ask you, how can you provide high assurance in security? How can you provide that complete wrapper of security, regardless of where a device is, regardless of where an application sits or what cloud is being accessed? How can you make all of these things happen in your environment? And I want to close today with asking you this question. What's going to be the first step that you take towards the modern edge? We know that this is here. We know that the need is now, and we know that we have the technology to be able to build a foundation that will set you up to be agile, flexible, and ready to take on the future. With that, thank you. Have a great day.